Glad that everyone's enjoying the lunch. There's plenty more back there. So, our second panel explores career paths within political journalism and communication. Iowa's first in the nation status in the presidential nomination process and its grassroots style of political involvement makes it a great place to begin a career in political journalism. Our topics will include internships and careers in political reporting, public affairs, political parties, public information, political advertising, we'll get to this one way or the other, Kevin, and opportunities for career advancement. Our panelists for working in political journalism and communication, your career starts here, include Scott Stenzo, right here to my left. He's the former Deputy White House Press Secretary to President George W. Bush. In 2005, Scott received the Outstanding Young Alumni Award from the Iowa State University Alumni Association. In 2007, he was elected to the Iowa State Alumni Association Board of Directors. He also serves on our Green Knee Advisory Council. He currently resides in Seattle, Washington, where he has founded Stansel's Communications, a PR, crisis communications, and media training firm for corporate clients, government leaders, and political candidates. Next, to Scott. Whoops. Is Beth Levine. Beth Levine is Communications Director for Senator Chuck Grassley on the Senate Judiciary Committee. He's on the committee, obviously, not Beth. She's worked in Washington, D.C. for almost 11 years. She grew up on a farm near Atlantic, and she's a 1998 graduate of ISU Journalism School. She also played on an Iowa girls basketball team. Right?
Iowa State.
Iowa State. Yeah. Okay, and next, Fred Love. He graduated from Iowa State in 2008 with a double major in journalism and political science. He joined Congressman Latham's office in February 2009 as communications director, and he's still there yet. Okay, and then last but not least, we have Jessica. And Jessica is an Iowa State, she will graduate from the journalism school in December. She has interned at CNN in New York City and at the Center for Media and Democracy. Currently, she's an intern at the Des Moines Register, and her political experience including covering state and local politics and protests in Wisconsin, must have been very interesting, the straw poll in caucuses in Iowa, and the local branches to the Occupy protests that are going on right now. Our moderator for this panel is our own Associate Professor Jay Newell. He's an Associate Professor in the Advertising Program. Jay became a political junkie when he was shooting CNN promotions in 1988 to the Democratic Convention in Atlanta. He joined the Green Knee School faculty after completing his PhD in mass media at Michigan State University. His research focuses on media saturation, and his pre-ISU career was a promoter, producer, and executive with CNN, TNT, and Nickelodeon. Here we go, Jay.
I am just in awe of being here with this panel here. I just can't wait to get you guys started, but I just wanted to show you something first. I do a lot of work with our students on getting them started in careers, and I'm glad to see a couple of them here. And I wanted to figure out where being a political staffer was sort of on the prestige scale. And so what it is, I looked it up, and it's not there. Okay. This is the last big survey was done about 2004, 2006 of jobs with the most prestige. So you've got scientist and firefighter and teacher and wait for it, journalist. Okay, 14%. Okay, and so I asked my students to fill out their own survey so I could figure out where political staffer was. Okay, and this is what 100 students came up with. Yes. Well, it's better than being a banker. Okay. So, if you're a journalist or, I don't know, but at least, and I asked them this other question, and it's always a lot better than being a So as long as you have a brother or a sister, or the weird kid who lives down the street who went to U of I, you can tell your mom you're working in political communications. It's okay. It's okay. I'm going to turn it over, and Scott, could you maybe start by talking about what you do and how you get to it?
Certainly. So I got my start actually in politics. I oftentimes get asked, by friends who in Washington, D.C. or now out in Seattle, how you got involved in politics. And I say it's luck of geography oftentimes, because Iowa, we have a very unique opportunity to be involved in the political process at a very high level. Iowa gets a lot of scrutiny because of the Iowa caucuses, gets a lot of scrutiny from elected officials, it gets a lot of scrutiny from the mainstream news media, and that's really how I got my start. I had internships. I had an internship in Senator Grassley's office when I was in college. I really got my start in elective sort of politics by managing Fraternity Brothers' campaign for government of the student body here at Iowa State. He was successful. And we had recounts and things like that, so that prepared me for Florida in 2000. But what I do now is I've taken that experience that I've gained in politics and I've applied it sort of in the corporate setting. And I do media training for executives on how to talk to reporters. I spent a good share of my career trying to help candidates conduct better interviews. And so those skills in terms of preparation and getting ready to speak to a reporter and convey your message in the best possible fashion really do translate in a lot of different ways. And I've tried to take that and apply it to the corporate world and focused a lot, of late anyway, on technology as well, because that's just simply an interest area of mine, and Seattle is a tech center. So that's what I do now.
Could you talk a little bit about what you do, Beth, and also if we can get broader about what sort of jobs are available that are jobs that you can get paid for doing in political communication?
I got started in Senator Grassley's office, actually, by the luck of the draw. I knew some people there, and that helped. So I guess what I always tell people is networking is such a huge part of finding a job. Because a lot of it is you have to have a skill set, which is what Greenlee prepares you for, but knowing people in the right places is a big deal, and nobody tells you that. But if knowing the right people and being in the right place at the right time is really, really important. My job in Senator Grassley's communications office our job is to help him communicate with the people of Iowa, and we have in our office, it's very much about representative government and making that process of representative government work, the two-way communication between Iowans and Senator Grassley. And so our job is to help facilitate that through all sorts of different media, new media, social media, the traditional media. When I first started, it was just the traditional media. And now we've had to expand and learn all these new communication devices because guess what? Not every Iowan reads the Des Moines Register, and not every Iowan reads the local North Scott Press. So you have to figure out a way to reach all of these different people through these new mediums, and that's something that we've all learned as we've gone along. But that's what my job entails. And in our office now, we hired somebody who just does all of our new media technology, and so that's a skill set that many of us didn't have. And so we hired somebody to do it. So there are all sorts of new opportunities out there with what journalism is now becoming is this huge growing field.
What sort of job titles are there?
We have, let's see. I will preface this by saying in our office, the salaries are not usually very high, as Senator Grassley is well known for. So titles are very cheap. So we have right now 4 people in our press office. We have a communications director, a press secretary, we have a communications advisor, and we have a deputy press secretary. And the deputy press secretary is also, his title is integrated media coordinator, I think. So there's also, there's lots of different things. And one of communications advisor. She does most of the speech writing. So there's somebody who focuses on that. And then there's a couple others of us who focus on working with the media more than the others.
Thank you. Fred?
Well, I guess if you want to know how I got my start in politics, it was very much because of my experience at the Iowa State Daily. I started out covering a political beat and really enjoyed it. And the way that I think I got my foot in the door with Latham's office had a lot to do with the fact that Congressman Latham lives here in Ames. And I was, as a political reporter for the Daily, I was covering his office all the time. I think they probably got tired of this, amateurish Daily reporter calling them every week and doing stories. But that was actually how I kind of got my foot in the door. And eventually, after I graduated, someone in Congressman Latham's office approached me and asked me if I would be interested in applying for a communications position in the office. I think maybe the big difference between what Beth just said and what goes on the House of Representatives side is that there are smaller staffs, especially in our office. I'm kind of the one-man press shop. We don't have 4 people to do press. We have one person that does communications, and so that means I get stretched pretty thin. A lot of weekends, a lot of long hours. But I also kind of got a really broad experience. I write speeches, do press releases, newsletters. I run his Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. So I was producing his monthly TV show for a long time. All these things I had never really thought that I would get an opportunity to do. I've gotten some really broad experience in the office. So I guess that would be, if I were explaining the difference between what happens on the Senate side and the House side, at least in my experience, that's been the main difference.
Jessica, and then you're not working on staff. You're working for a publication, and you've worked for CNN. Can you talk about the sort of things you've done just while you're as a student here at Iowa State?
Yeah, absolutely. I would also second the importance of working at the Daily, probably because I was the editor-in-chief last year, so I'm still plugging it. But, student media is the best place to get started from the side of wanting to cover politics or really anything else. So, I think one of the first stories I did at the Daily was covering the local city council race. And you kind of just jump in feet first and take it from there. At CNN, I actually didn't really do political journalism at all, but that helped me get the internship that I had last summer. I was working in Madison, Wisconsin, and fortunately, I worked at a small enough publication that they needed someone to go, do all the State House coverage that wasn't getting done. So just walked into the Capitol, started introducing myself to people, and it really is about who you know. As Beth said, if you can have someone introduce you to a senator or a representative, then that's a good contact to have. I covered the protests that were happening in Madison. I covered some of the bills that were getting passed there that are sort of controversial within the state. And since I've been back in Iowa, I've covered the straw poll, which I did for the Daily. I've been covering the Occupy protests for the Register with my internship there, just kind of trying to take advantage of every opportunity that comes my way. Wisconsin and Iowa are 2 states that I've had access to that just kind of being in the right place at the right time when things are happening.
You mentioned it's a matter of who you know and who you made contacts with. How much of working on a political staff is a matter of what you believe? I noticed, Fred, in your resume, you talk about as a job objective, you were looking to work for a Republican. Okay? Can you talk about that? Because out of advertising or newspaper, we don't pick sides. We don't pick sides. It's nonpartisan. How partisan is the job picture?
It matters. I'll tell you. I wouldn't be surprised if everyone complains about the poisonous partisan nature of Capitol Hill politics, and that, in my experience, you see it every day. If you're going to work on the Hill, you're going to get your hands dirty with politics, and there's going to be things that, it's pretty partisan. And so I think most congressional offices wouldn't necessarily, they'll look at your political background, they'll look at, if you've been in newspapers advocating certain causes and things like that, and they'll take that into consideration. I think most offices would probably hire an independent in a lot of circumstances, but I think it's probably pretty rare, at least in my experience, to see, for instance, a Democratic office hiring someone who's been, president of the College Republicans or something like that. So, I mean, if you want to work on Capitol Hill, then yeah, it does matter. And maybe Beth can talk about what it's like in the Senate.
Yeah, I would just add to that, though. I think it's really important to know what your own politics are, but in the end, you have to set all those aside because you work for a member of Congress, and it's his politics or her politics that matter. It's not your own. Because we're out promoting him, and like for me, for Senator Grassley, I'm out promoting his agenda, not my own. And so I think that's really, really important that know your own politics because that's a belief system that you have, and it's going to make it a lot easier for you to work for a member. But you, in the end, you have to set all that aside because you're not going to agree with them on every single issue. So it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what I believe in for my job.
Scott, do you have anything to add about that?
Yeah, I would say this, to put it sort of maybe crassly in advertising context, if you've been hired to sell Ford trucks and you really hate Ford trucks and you'd rather be driving a Chevy, it's not going to be a good fit for you. So it's important that you go into a situation knowing that your core beliefs are going to advance in a certain way. And I will also say this, I mean, one of the reasons that I was drawn to politics and continue to stay with it is that you have a sense of cohesion when your organization, your campaign staff, your official staff is all trying to move the needle in a certain direction. And that is not always found in, say, the corporate world, where you have maybe disparate ideas. But in politics, because you're advancing a certain core belief, that's what, to me, sort of makes it fun because you develop a lot of cohesion with your coworkers.
How do you get started in this? I mean, you mentioned that you started doing a Fraternity Brothers campaign. Many of the students that I work with, they're coming to really communication first. They're thinking about that. They're not thinking about politics or whatever. How do you get started, especially in this environment here in Iowa, where it's like no place else on the planet in terms of its political operations?
For me, it was a class in 1994. I served as an intern in Senator Grassley's office in the summer of '94 between my junior and senior year of college, and a class on political communications where the Republican Party chair was coming to speak about the just concluded 1994 elections where Governor Branstad, now yet again Governor Branstad, won re-election. And I literally went up to him after he spoke at our class and said, I'm interested in politics. I'm interested in the presidential race, and these candidates are going to be setting up their campaign staffs next year in 1995 in advance of the 96 campaign. What can I do to get involved? And he said, well, send me your resume and I'll share it with the staffs that are getting set up. And he did. And so I had calls from Phil Graham's campaign, Bob Dole's campaign, and also from Lamar Alexander's campaign. And it was really that who you know and making that effort to try to reach out and get that started. And Iowa gives a unique opportunity to do that, so people should take advantage of it.
Do you start out is the expectation that you start out as a volunteer and then move into professionally paid work, or how does that work for you guys?
I got involved in politics just by volunteering. And then I actually was working in Clinton, Iowa at the time and volunteered on then Governor Bush's campaign. So that's how I got involved, and it just helped. I guess it helped my resume as a volunteer and wanting to then work into politics at some point in the future. But when I graduated, I didn't have any vision of working in politics. So it just kind of evolved that way. But that's how I got my start, is volunteering.
Well, how does the transition work? Because we see tens of thousands of volunteers, doing stuffing envelopes and putting up posters and so on. How does the transition work? How do you get noticed to make that move, onto staff?
I think it's because you're there all the time, and you're networking while you're there, because there are lots of people who have that same goal. It's that cohesive group that you're a part of, and you know what? The boss in that volunteer office may go on to be have a more prominent role in an elected office, and if that person knows that you were a hard worker, they're going to say, hey, I remember that guy he came every night to stuff envelopes or make calls or whatever.
Yeah, I would echo that. And you can't necessarily go into a situation thinking this is going to be my ideal job. You can't go in thinking I'm going to be the press secretary for a member of Congress or candidate X. Your first job may be, at the rally wiping down the bleachers so they're not dusty. And that could be the first thing, but you have to put yourself in the situation where you can meet those people. My first job for then Governor Bush on his campaign was doing the same job that I had done 4 years before for Bob Dole. It was a job that I didn't necessarily crave. It was organizing volunteers and doing phone banks and things like that. But I saw that as the way to get to the communication shop and meet the people who were going to be making those decisions. So you kind of have to take those risks and try to, put yourself in the right spot to make the case that, yes, I've got the skills to do this and you should give me a shot.
Mark, you have a question?
I may be having a wrong assumption, but I'm assuming that y'all all got in politics because you wanted to make the world a better place. At least it's part of your reason. Now, it's interesting, how much of that dies or disappears, or do you still have that, especially because, Scott, you've been there for 15, 16 years, and Beth for 11, and Fred for 2, and Jessica just getting started. So, I mean, it'd be nice to see, do you still have that, I want to change the world, and make it a better place, or does it kind of, the politics,
You get jaded.
kill that?
You get beat down by the system. I still enjoy it, and when I came out of college and had my first job in D.C., I thought, I'll be in D.C. for 2 years. That'll be tops. Then I'll take that experience and go into the private sector, do whatever. But I found it very fulfilling. I found it very meaningful to be a part of something that I did think was making a difference and was having a positive impact. I went back out after I concluded service at the White House for President Bush in January of 2009. I went back out to Seattle thinking I was done with politics. Well, last year I was asked to run a campaign opposing a proposed state income tax in the state of Washington. Now, I didn't think I would go back into politics sort of at a campaign staff level, but I saw that as an opportunity to make a difference in something I could be passionate about, and so I did it. And so I don't think that ever goes away. You can sort of compartmentalize it, but I don't think there will ever come a time where I won't be involved. It may just be attending events or providing advice to candidates from time to time and not necessarily in a staff role, but for me, that fire hasn't been put out, even though there is a lot of sausage making that you just have to deal with. So
I agree. It's invigorating. I tell you, being out there in D.C. is constant motion, and that it makes it really fun and interesting, and you're passionate about what's going on, and you are trying to make a difference. And I agree. I don't think that dies. I don't think you do. It's hard some days, but it's just like every job or every position. Some days are harder than others.
I would mostly agree with that. It's easy to get swept up in sort of the we win, you lose kind of mentality where it's a competition and a zero-sum game, but maybe to kind of illustrate how you still kind of keep that fire in your belly. The healthcare debate was just one of the most brutal debates that I've been a part of in 2009 into 2010. But I think in our office we did a really good job of messaging. We got Congressman Latham out there doing interviews and media spots, press releases, social media, and I felt like we were doing our job and we won we won the message war. But in the end, the legislation was approved and the atmosphere in our office was defeated. Even though everyone worked so hard and everyone did their jobs really well, the policy outcome what we thought was not what we wanted, and so that's what mattered most. I mean, the policy is what was in the front seat, and everything else took a back seat to that.
Can I throw in a question about just about outcomes? For people who are, say, in advertising or journalism, where you get your joy in the job is often in the things that you've done. The article that you've written, the ad that you've created, not necessarily in the outcome of the article that you wrote or how many sales that ad made. How does it work for you guys? Do you look at what you've crafted, the speech you've written or whatever, or do you look at whether it's when something the candidate got his way, and your legislation passed? What's the joys in this work? Go ahead.
I think for me, it's, I guess, part of it is just being involved in politics is very interesting for me, but I'm coming at this as more of a journalistic perspective. And so for me, if someone read what I wrote and said, well, hey, I didn't know that, or it caused them to think of something in a different way, maybe. So, a lot of the stories I was writing in Madison they weren't going to change anything. There's kind of everything is dominated by the Republicans right now, so that they're pushing through that particular legislation. And so if I'm talking to Democrats, they might have interesting things to say to me, but if I write an article about it, nothing's going to change, but people might learn something new or might think about something in a different way. And also, I guess, if I can help restore some of the public trust, because I think the one thing that politicians and journalists really have in common right now is that the public doesn't trust them. I think in September there was a Gallup poll. 55% said that they had little trust in the media, 50% had little trust in the legislature, and 30% had little trust in the executive branch. So if I can practice journalism and cover politics that are helping to restore and earn some of that back, then that would be a win for me.
Within that idea, you guys, I think all of you are from Iowa, right? I mean, there's something, there's Iowa nice,
Kind of.
okay? There's a way of doing things, and there's a way of living in your communities and talking to people and interacting, and it's one of the reasons I love teaching here, because they are nice. People have strong feelings, but people are really, there's a lot of nice here. You're in worlds, and you talked about a brutal, debate, brutal process. Is there anything that you guys try to do in your day-to-day jobs that bring nice back to it?
Try to be nice.
So what does that, okay, specifically for students, what does that mean? How does that play out in a particular situation?
Well, I have to say sometimes it backfires. Just for example, I was pitching a story to the AP, the Justice Department reporter, maybe a week or so ago. I was very nice about it, and he included, or did not fail to include, several things that were very important and put a horrible slant on the story for Senator Grassley. And I called him on it for the first time, trying not to be so nice, and I haven't heard from him since. So I guess, it's always, I have the feeling that, you catch more flies with honey. And I think that if we're nice to, for instance, if I'm nice to a reporter and I'm helpful, it's going to come back and help us someday. Maybe not right then in that story, but sooner or later, they're going to think to call Senator Grassley's office for a topic, for a comment, something like that. But it's hard some days to be nice. It really is, because they're mean.
It can be. I would say this, it's the way I think it translates, and there are a lot of people from Iowa who got their start, or in Washington, D.C., who got their start in politics in Iowa. I think that's a healthy thing. Iowa, you have to have conversations with each other. It's a divided state. It's not a one-party state. So you do have a certain, in my view, level of discourse that is respectful. And even though you may have a very different view, even within, say, a staff meeting for your elected official that you're working for, you might have a different view than someone else on the staff. I think the way that translates for me was always trying to put yourself in their shoes, listen to that argument, and see if it does make sense, and try to have an open mind, which I think is, I would hope anyway, sort of a hallmark of Iowans, that because of this caucus process, you get a lot of information and you have an opportunity to weigh a lot of choices and do so in a respectful way.
One thing that I would stress as far as keeping an Iowa nice relationship with reporters. I've been on both sides of that relationship. I've been a reporter working with press secretaries, and I've been a press secretary working with reporters. And the one thing that I've learned is you need each other to do your job as well as you possibly can. So, I mean, my best advice is to, whenever I meet a reporter that I'm working with for the first time, I make sure that I make it clear to them that I'm a resource for you. Whenever you need anything, even if it's not necessarily something in Congressman Latham's wheelhouse, I'm happy to run the traps and maybe work on background, or just maybe we'll grab coffee or something like that. So you need each other to do your jobs well. And my other bit of advice would be to never try your best never to burn a bridge, because that relationship is going to get contentious at some point. You're going to have to call a reporter on something that you didn't like, or they're going to feel like you haven't been as forthcoming as they wanted you to be. So the important thing is just keep it professional and understand that both of you are just trying to do your jobs as best you can.
Let me ask you sort of a basic question, not knowing this business world at all. What is job security and job mobility like? Are you tied to the fortunes of this particular person that you're working for? So if he retires or loses an election, that's it, your career is over? I mean, how does this work in your world?
Well, there isn't a whole lot of job security. So if that's your main driver, then this is probably not the business for you. I got excitement out of it because you can see, particularly with campaign, I've now worked on 6, you can see the end date, which I actually like because you have the ultimate measurement of election day and you see the success or failure of your work. I've often recounted the story, and I'll probably embarrass my mom by telling this story, but in 2000 I went back to take that job on the Bush campaign, a job that I thought was maybe a little bit beneath me, but I wanted to get my foot in the door a little bit. Well, the Iowa caucuses ended. I ended up helping out in Michigan and Missouri, and then Governor Bush got the nomination, and the campaign sort of went into money-saving mode and weren't really hiring people for that next step. So I ended up living with my mother here in Ames for a couple months. And remember one day, I think we were going to lunch at Hickory Park, and she said, "Well, Scott, do you ever get depressed?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" She said, "Well, you're 27 years old, and you live at home with your mother, and you don't have a job." And I said, "Well, I wasn't before, but now that you put it that way." But, I was almost ready to move on from the idea that I would be involved in politics because I thought I'd taken that run, and it wasn't going to work out. Well, basically about a week later, I get a call from the campaign. "We want you at the headquarters in Texas. Can you be there tomorrow?" And that just kind of happens in politics, and so you have to be ready for those opportunities, and you have to be willing to accept that uncertainty. But I do think that there is mobility within politics because you do the good work, you make a reputation with reporters, you make a reputation with other political leaders to get things done, and that translates. And it translates if you have Iowa on your resume.
I have a question. This came out on the Twitter. The stickiest situation that you've ever encountered, and how did you handle it? And I'm going to put you on the spot, Jessica. You first.
Oh, stickiest situation. I'm assuming we mean political journalism here. Gosh, I honestly haven't been in a ton of sticky situations, which I can say is fortunate. I had the potential for one, I guess. This summer, I was trying to get an interview with a representative or an assemblywoman in Wisconsin, and I knew she had just gotten kind of burned by a reporter on the radio, someone sort of a personality that took one of her quotes completely out of context, and I was trying to do a story on the thing that she had been sort of unfairly quoted on, and I was kind of nervous, I guess, to approach her on that. But luckily for me, she kind of views her job and my job as the same in that we're trying to serve the public. So she didn't assume that all journalists were bad people, which I appreciated. And she thanked me for doing the story that I was doing and thanked me for giving her an opportunity to clear some of those things up. And I think a lot of sticky situations in this field on both sides do kind of result from that feeling of getting burned one way or the other, like we kind of just talked about a little bit. But the best way that I've found is to remind each other that we sort of have some of the same goals, or at least we're trying to do our jobs to the best of our abilities. And, I appreciated her honesty with me, and she appreciated that I wrote a fair story and quoted her correctly. And we developed a really nice professional relationship after that, and that opened some doors for me to do other stories that I wanted to do. That was probably not a super sticky situation, but it could have been one.
Fred?
As far as, I guess when I think of a sticky situation in my job, I think of, maybe like a political crisis or crisis communications, and I don't think I've dealt with as many of those as maybe Beth and Scott have over their years in political communications. But one thing that I have learned about when there's a crisis that you need to address is it's good to have a plan ahead of time. If there's a big breaking story that maybe catches you off guard, and you need to get your boss out there on the story because it has direct implications on him, you have a plan about who's going to be part of the discussion, and you make sure that you've got your point of contact who's going to be doing the communicating. So in our office, that means if something comes up, the congressman's involved in the conversation, our chief of staff, myself, and a couple of other staffers. And so we come up with a strategy. We do it quickly. And then we have one point of contact who speaks with the press or actually does the communicating, whether that's me or whether that's the congressman himself. And I've learned that in a crisis, you make sure you have your message, and you need to get that message out there, because I think maybe oftentimes the worst thing you can do in a sticky situation is just have a vacuum, to just have silence. I think you need to be able to get out there on the story and shape it as best you can. So I guess that'd be my advice.
This actually just happened in the last year. Many of you may know Senator Grassley's been investigating a program run by the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Agency in Arizona that has allowed guns to walk across the border, knowingly walk across the border. And at one point in time last spring, we've been working with several reporters on the story, and one of the people I learned last spring, one of the reporters, learned of the name of a confidential informant in the investigation and for the government, and was about to go on the air. And so it was a frantic few moments in conversations with the Justice Department, and then with our own policy staff and our investigators, and then relaying that information, me making the phone call to the reporter saying, you cannot do this because this guy's family is going to get killed if you put his name out there. And luckily, because of the relationship we'd had and the past experience that we'd worked together on several stories and on this investigation in particular, he decided not to air it. But it was a tense day of watching the coverage of the story, just to make sure that guy's name never got out there, and it still hasn't. But I guess that's the stickiest, and the way it was resolved was because of the prior relationship that we had with the reporter.
Any more stories?
It seemed like every day was a sticky situation at the White House. So it's maybe a little bit hard to narrow it down. I would say that Fred is wise beyond his years with the approach to crisis communications, because in politics that is oftentimes where you make your difference in how you handle those situations. I would say one from just awkward and maybe not necessarily sticky situation. I was talking with someone yesterday about how you, as a communications person for a campaign, communicate how your candidate did when they clearly didn't do well in a debate. And the first debate in 2004 in Miami, President Bush admittedly did not do well. We got back on Air Force One to leave, and he was like, well, sorry, guys. He basically knew that it wasn't his best performance. And so how do you, as a communications professional for that campaign, decide, okay, what is it? How do you put forward a good story when the prevailing theme of most of those stories would be President Bush didn't do that well. So finding those areas, whether it's a policy issue that you can point to or some other gaffe that maybe John Kerry made, that was one of those difficult 2 or 3 days where you're fighting a story which, and for all intents and purposes, is pretty accurate, but you'd rather it not be out there. So that was a tough one.
Okay. This might be a little side note, but I grew up on political movies. Okay. What is your favorite political movie, if you have one? And is it a documentary? Is it something that are they real, or are they comedies to you, or what's the values of them? Do you have any?
I guess I have two. I think if I didn't say All the President's Men, Mark Witherspoon would have my head. But State of Play came out in the last, 4 years or so. Russell Crowe, Ben Affleck, I think, was in it, based off a BBC miniseries, actually, and that, I love it. It's, I think, mostly just because it's a great combination of politics and journalism, which are my two passions, and I think when people like me watch those movies, they see themselves in the characters a lot, I would say.
Maybe at the risk of looking like a wimp, I think I would go with The American President. I love the dialogue. I'm a sucker for the president falling in love, and they have the state dinner and the dancing scene. So I guess that would be mine.
I would say Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. I don't even know how true it is anymore, but it's really, I enjoy it and think about how things used to be on Capitol Hill.
Well, now that my previous or my choices have been both taken, I tend to like the ones that are on the periphery of maybe what I knew. The Bourne Identity type movies. Granted, it's an action movie, but it deals with policy and intelligence. I wasn't involved with that, but I find it fascinating, and I probably fly spec the ones that are deep into the White House, having been there too much to the point where I probably don't get as much enjoyment out of them because I'm like, oh, that's not the way that works, and so it's a distraction. So I like the ones that are just sort of on the outer edges of that.
Are any of you guys writing a movie where you think George Clooney will be playing your role?
I threaten a book with Senator Grassley all the time.
I'm asking all the questions. Are there questions?
Did you work with Scott McClellan?
Did.
And what's your take on his book?
My mother, who's sitting here, always used to say, if you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. That said, Scott was a friend of mine. I worked with all 4 press secretaries for President Bush. Knew Scott from '99 on until he wrote that book. Was there when the excerpts came out and he claimed that they were inaccurate. Was there when the book was released, and he spent 2 days on the Today Show, sort of criticizing the boss, who I believe gave him opportunities that he would never have received. I was at Scott's wedding, and I played poker with Scott a month before that book came out, and he misled me about what was in the book. So that is one of the saddest episodes, I think, of my time with President Bush, is to see what I think was someone who got bitter because he was relieved of his duties. When a new chief of staff came in, the chief of staff decided to make some changes. One of those was at the position of press secretary. So the book itself I haven't spent a lot of time with, but I know enough about it to know that I don't want to read it in full. So.
How do you handle off-the-record comments and, by the way, your answer is off-the-record?
I usually just start a conversation right away by saying, can we just talk on background, not for attribution? And a lot of reporters, it's funny, the national reporters have a much better understanding of and are more willing to go off the record and not for attribution than the Iowa reporters are. Very much. It's always a long a much more detailed question with Iowa reporters than it is with national reporters. And I always say that I'll help you in any way I can, get you something on the record when we're done with our conversation to get you what you need for your story.
Can I ask a question? I mean, we have these Twitter things, okay? And more and more I'm even seeing people answering only the first line of an email that our thinking process has been narrowed down. And you guys must deal with any number of situations where the boss has made some sort of extended, nuanced statement, and then something about this long is pulled out and put up there, and it's just off to the races. I mean, how do you deal with, how do you deal with the sort of stupidization of dialogue?
First of all, my boss gets in trouble for what he writes on Twitter, way more than his long statements.
So it's self-inflicted
Yes.
in your case. Okay. I mean, part of my job when I was working at Turner was having to say, well, what Ted meant to say was, how do you do that? I mean, do you have to do that for your work, Fred?
I mean, it's always a challenge, I think, keeping your boss on message, so I think what we usually do is Congressman Latham is, he's an appropriator and he's well versed in budget issues and the real substance of policy, and so that's not necessarily a problem. But we always try to brief him before every interview, before every speech. We brief him as much as we can on the policy, on the real substance of the issue. But then I always throw in maybe top 5, top line messages or talking points that I think really encapsulate the message. And I think one of the lessons that I learned from listening to Frank Luntz and reading his books a lot is that you need to ask yourself before you speak, what's the one thing that I want people to come away with, and that needs to be you need to repeat it. You hit it immediately and often, and that's usually I think the best way to get the message that you want through.
Jessica, you're on a completely different side of this. I mean, how does this work with you?
Well, I would argue that Twitter is not necessarily the stupidization of reporting. I think you have the same problem with Twitter that you have with cable news, that you have with writing a headline for a story in an old-fashioned newspaper, is that, you're looking for the snappy thing that someone said, and if you have a good communications director, then you've crafted that message correctly, and, reporters eat these things up. But I think responsible reporting at any level, whether it's, I write stories, I take photos, I shoot videos, I tweet, I do all of this, and I would never tweet something that wasn't, carefully put into context, and that, you're not going to get, nothing good can come of tweeting something irresponsibly just to get followers or just to get attention. I think it's still really all about responsible reporting and responsible message crafting on both sides. And regardless of the medium, you're always going to have a few quotes or a few crazy things that people say that are taken and blown up. But hopefully there could be reporting done to clear that up.
Would you talk a little bit about your coverage of Occupy Iowa State? I mean,
Sure.
our conversation where you talked about you don't even use Notepad anymore.
Oh, yeah,
And how you gather information now.
I spent the last week or so covering the Occupy protests at Iowa State and then in Des Moines as well, and so much of that has really been driven by social media and has been propelled. It really wouldn't exist without it. Similarly, my reporting I don't think would be effective if I weren't taking advantage of those tools. So I had a notebook with me. I didn't use it. I had a recorder, I had my iPhone, and I had a nicer camera for the nice print quality photo that I needed to get. But yeah, my entire day is spent talking to people, taking notes, tweeting what they said, and if I look back at my Twitter stream from that day, I can find the narrative of what happened because I was providing real-time updates, and never anything irresponsible or anything out of context. There were some crazy things that I overheard that might have gotten a rise out of people, but they weren't really part of the overall story of the day. But yeah, absolutely, I'm always on the iPhone, and I think it's probably one of the greatest reporting tools that it's not even backpack journalism, it's back pocket journalism now.
Well, speaking of crazy things, we have a question here. How do you handle Representative Wiener scandal? Okay, and this was the guy who was texting, speaking of iPhones, was finding, photo, or texting photos. What do you do when you're in the middle of a car, when you walk up and your organization is in a car wreck?
I'd say be honest. If what got Congressman Weiner in trouble, I think, was because he lied at first, then kind of, wavered. And I think if you're honest from the very beginning, you cause a lot less problem for yourself, and the story tends to go away a lot faster.
Yeah, I would agree. He sort of blew it with his concerted cover-up effort, and he was caught in a behavior that was abhorrent, and but he could have come out and said, you know what, I have a problem. I need to account for it. I need to spend time with my wife talking about it. He could have been real, and he wasn't. He was a phony from the get-go, and that eventually caught up with him. And so when he, have a press conference to apologize for it, 9 or 10 or whatever days later it was, no one's going to want to hear that. I mean, no one at all. So honesty is the best policy.
I would absolutely agree with that, and I think one of my main, maybe personal ethical rules. I saw Dr. Bouget in here earlier, but there is ethics in politics, and especially when you're a press secretary, don't lie. Just be truthful. If a reporter asks you a question that you're not sure about, it's a totally fair move to stop the interview and say, I don't know the answer to that question, let me get back to you, or I'm not sure I'm authorized to answer that question, let me get back to you. But don't make something up, don't lie.
Well, actually, we're kind of running to the end of our time, and and you mentioned ethics, so you're going to bring this on yourself. One more question. In every organization, there are commandments, okay? Certainly in religion, there are commandments, and those are the ones that are written down. In organizations, they're not, okay? For your outfits, what is at least one thou shalt not? That is just, a transgression, that is just an end of the line career killer. What is it? Think about it a second, and what's a thou shalt not for your world? Who wants to go first? I'll volunteers for this one.
I would go, thou shalt not have an ego. There's in a congressional office, there's people that have to fold letters and seal envelopes and things like that. And if you've got time, you should absolutely pitch in with everything you can. You're a team, and I would say show up early, stay late, and don't be afraid to do tasks that you might think are menial, but are still important to the overall goal of your office. So I think that would be my thou shalt not.
Beth, you want?
Sure. I think it's thou shalt not see your name in print when your boss's name could be in print.
Great. Jessica?
Gosh, I mean, there's lots of journalism ethics codes out there, but I think thou shalt not get it wrong, and if you do, make it right. Being honest goes a long way on both sides of this situation. So do your best to get the facts right, do your best to report them fairly, and if you happen to get it wrong, don't be afraid to fix it.
I'd say a little bit of takeoff on what Fred said. Thou shalt not believe that any task is beneath you. In politics, a lot of times you're going to be asked to do things, whether it's wiping down those bleacher seats or doing some fact checking on a release that you didn't write that won't get you any attention, or learning to put together a website just because you're the young person in the office and everyone assumes that you know that. All of those things are going to help you build a foundation that you can achieve in your career, and that if you always remember that, no matter where you are in your career, that something that you may do, that fact that you may check, that you didn't really want to be tasked with, and you fix it and you get it right, might make all the difference for what your boss says, for how the policy discussion goes. So never believe that any task is beneath you.
That's terrific advice. And thou shalt not run these things too late. So I want to thank you before I'm finished. But Carol, can I turn it over to you? Oh, do you want to wrap it up? this has been amazing. To see that you guys coming together, to hear the way it works, and I'm hoping that there might be one or two people, in this group here who are thinking, I could give this stuff a shot. It's January. What are we talking about? January 3rd, 5th?
Third.
For the caucuses. So there's plenty of things to be done between now and then. And we like students who go out and do things and get stuff. And honestly, people don't have that sort of access to politics outside the state that they do right here. And and you guys are living proof of what you can do when you get started from Ames.
I would add that I know our office, we have tons of internships. So semester-long internships, summer internships. So if you want to come to DC, we love journalism, Greenlee School students. So I think Christine's here. She was an intern over the summer. So apply. It's fun.
Good. Well, I'm going to leave it on that. It doesn't get more upbeat than that, so I'm leaving it there. Thank you all for doing this, and thank you.